So I want to start just by telling you a little story, and this is the God's honest truth. So I met a client, and this morning I got on the elevator and I had given a keynote for this client at one of their conferences in January. And someone who had been in the keynote got on the elevator and said, "Oh, hi, I didn't know you were here." And I said, "Oh, it's great to see you." And someone said, "Well, you remember Megan from the keynote?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, I've quoted you like 10 times. And I thought, that is the best possible compliment you could have paid me. And it's also evidence of the power of taking the time to design messages to stick, because that doesn't necessarily happen. So I thought that would be a perfect segue to talk about Made to Stick and the book that we're going to talk about today. Do folks want to give some initial thoughts, or do you want me to just jump right into the questions?
Oh, just jump. We'll
Just
jump in.
All right.
Go for
jump
it.
right in. That's my really bad parachute impression. Okay. So the reason I chose this book was because we've all had this conversation collectively and individually that we've been talking about customer experience for so long, and yet it somehow feels like it goes in one ear and out the other of the people that we're talking to. And so I said, all right, how do we use what's in this book to potentially solve this problem? So I wanted to start with just hearing everybody else's thoughts and experiences on why don't the ideas related to customer experience, why do we think they don't typically stick?
Well, I'll just get started, you know me, and say, I think we are just consistently burying the lead. And, I think we spend so much time building credibility that we feel like we have to teach what the problem is, show how we resolved it, of course, provide all the analytics, and then wow people with what we've accomplished. So, I mean, if I just started with our very first need is like push it up there, get it right to the top and go from there. So, bearing the lead is probably our primary root problem when I think of our team.
I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about too is especially where it talked about like statistics, and what really resonated with me was it's the relationship that matters. It's not the numbers. And I think sometimes it's so easy to get caught up in quantification, this amount of issues, but it's really the relationship to the product, to the traffic that you can really tell that story.
Yeah, and I don't know, Jeff, if you've seen this yet, but our next book for next month is a follow-up that Chip wrote only recently with Carla Starr called Making Numbers Count.
Oh, yeah.
And it's basically after years of teaching, he teaches a class on Made to Stick. The section on using numbers to make ideas sticky was still so problematic that he wrote a whole separate book on it. So that's actually going to be our May book on May 9th. It's 135 pages. So don't freak out that that's only a month from now. It took me like an hour and a half to listen to. Yes, the getting caught up in the quantification without thinking, what is the idea that we're trying to share? What is the message here?
Right. Why do these numbers mean something?
Yeah.
Yeah, as if people will just react or respond to the numbers themselves in isolation. So for me, Megan, and the curse of knowledge stood out, and working from the abstract to the concrete. And I'm going to probably get the story from the book wrong, so please correct me. But the story that really blew my mind, and there's so many of them, is the engineers working with the people that were making the piece of equipment. I don't know if you recall that story.
Yeah.
And basically, it turned out the engineers are very fixated on the plans, but the people building the equipment were like, just tell me which part to fix. And then the conclusion line was this. It sounded I like this. Do you think the engineer should have then gone halfway and the plant people gone halfway and compromised? No, the engineers needed to change their approach. And that really got me. It wasn't about meeting halfway and compromising. It was no, they need to kind of get down off their high horse and they need to go in there with the people doing and I think that line really struck me from the book. I see some of you nodding, so I'll stop talking. That maybe did the same for you, but moving from this abstract to this concrete. And I wonder sometimes if we CX people, I mean, I know we're throwing a lot of different kinds of people into one basket there, but maybe we get a bit abstract and lose sight of the concrete reality of the people that we're serving. I don't know. So,
Daniel, I'm going to say 100% we do. And that is one of the big sort of one of the sticky ideas that I've been trying to put out there is that ambiguity is actually one of our biggest problems. We are not concrete enough in the way we talk about customer experience. And so everybody kind of sort of knows what we are asking them to do, but not really. And we don't ever get concrete enough. So yes, that's definitively a problem. Hannah, I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
No, you're fine. That line stood out to me, what you just cited, Daniel, and then the one where he said something to the effect of the way you deliver a message is a cue to how they should react. So if you're going deep into an argument, people are going to frame themselves as an argument in the response. And if you go too overly emotional, then it's just an emotional response. And I think sometimes that's another of the many pitfalls, but that one in particular just resonated with me a lot.
Yeah. And Hannah, that reminds me of the first book we read, The Catalyst. There was this concept of the zone of acceptance, that what you're asking someone, the idea you're asking someone to buy into, if it's kind of too far from where they are today, it's a bridge too far for them to be willing to accept. And so it's that same kind of thing of kind of meeting people where they are and not getting them set up for an argument. And we've got some new folks who joined, Chris, Jason, and Zafar. I have promoted you all to panelists, which would mean that you could be on video. It's telling me that you have declined that, which is totally fine. But last time we had some problems where people wanted to be panelists and declined, and I didn't try a second time. So I'm just going to come right out and say, if you hit the wrong button accidentally, let me know and I will re-promote you. Okay. Anybody else have thoughts about why we think CX ideas don't stick, or things that kind of stood out in the book that remembered them?
I personally feel that that the CX ideas don't stick because at least what I've seen is that we are more focused on those quick wins, more to show that there is ROI to some of the CX activities we are doing. Rather, the book talks very well about, some of the stuff like being credible or even creative or even, the emotion part. So I think we keep that. I mean, when I read the book, I felt like this is something I need to practice at office, but what am I doing at office? I'm an XM scientist, so I'm all the time showing my client, here's the $100 you spent, and look, there is the ROI, the creativity, everything, not being practiced. So I think, where will the stickiness come from?
Yeah, I engineer by training here as well. So yeah, we kind of have our primary mode.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Safar. How are you?
How are you?
Thanks for joining
Thank you.
us.
Yeah, thank you for letting me join. Yeah,
Oh,
I think the one thing that stood out for me is the curse of knowledge, because I'm a teacher myself, and I sometimes tend to forget that I was too a novice, and so sometimes I have to remind myself about this, because otherwise I can be harsh to my students. I mean, over small issues.
Yeah, what do you teach, or what group do you teach?
Yeah, I am from Central Asia, Uzbekistan, and I teach English. So actually, I read this book a couple of years ago, and I'm reading it one more time. And this is all good stuff. I mean, there's another thing that really interesting was what was it called? Yeah, a bird in a hand is
A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
yes. I mean, because that kind of proverb exists in Uzbekistan too. In our in our folklore, there's kind of proverb that exactly the same meaning. I mean, that was
Exactly. And
interesting.
tapping into those things that people
Yeah.
have heard, metaphors are so powerful because you compare A to B, and then suddenly
Yeah.
it unlocks all of these things in people's minds. And that's where the curse of knowledge can hurt. I asked Safar because
Yeah.
my fiance is a college professor, and God help him, God bless him, he teaches college freshmen. And he has this incredible ability to take concepts and make them understandable and real and concrete for this group of people that I look at like, I don't even know what planet you're from. They're wonderful people. They're just from a different planet than I am in terms of life
Yeah.
experience. So yeah, absolutely.
I think of all the jobs, I think this book is very useful for teachers because you have to explain new topics, new concepts to your students, and there comes analogies in hand, right? You have to be able to find the right balance between accuracy and analogy.
Yep.
I mean, it's very useful for teachers.
Well, and
I
we're all
also-
teachers. Go ahead.
Sorry, Megan.
Okay.
Yeah, applying that to CX professionals too, I think is like very like relevant, I guess, for us because we're constantly in like I feel like a translator role between providing the customer's perspective, getting technology and business together. So being that point of clarity and kind of quickly getting folks on the same page, I think is like kind of, our bread and butter as well.
Yeah. And Sarah, to that point, we have to do this with a lot of different audiences, and I didn't want to stay too long on why messages don't stick, because the truth is a lot of messages do stick. And so a couple of you have already mentioned, Daniel, you mentioned the story, Zafar, you mentioned the proverb, Hannah, you mentioned something. Whether they're in this book or not, I just thought it would be fun to think about and look at things that have stuck, and then going back and thinking about why did they stick. And I'll tell you, one of mine came from my mom. I was in college and I had a professor who all he wanted you to do was regurgitate his own book back to him. Any sort of critical thinking in the essay, which is what I tried to do, got a lower grade. And my friends who phoned it in got an A. And I was so righteously indignant, like, this is just wrong. And my mother said, Megan, you never pass a class, you pass a teacher.
Yeah. Great quote.
Yes. And that has stuck with me, I think partly because it was surprising and unexpected, but it also applies. It's like, you don't get approval from a CEO, you get approval from a human. So anyway, that was the one that jumped to my mind. What about other folks, things that have stuck with you, and why?
I mean, there are two quotes that really stuck with me. The one is from Tolstoy: every happy family resembles to each other, but every unhappy family are different in his own way. I mean, that is very hard truth, Like I've seen many families, thank God. I'm one of the happy families. Like I've seen many families that are like very different in their own way. I mean, and the way they use it, the way authors use it, this kind of lines to enhance what their point is very, I mean, very great.
Yeah, and it's very rhythmic. I find
Yeah.
that things that stick, you know, every happy family is happy in the same way, but every unhappy family is unhappy in
Yeah.
its own way. That rhythm and repetition of words helps
Yes.
with that stickiness.
I'm really glad you brought up that quote so far. And can I put out a question to the group based on that
Yeah.
quote? Because
Sure.
it really, and again, because there are so many interesting people here. If you were applying that to CX, would you say this, and this is, I guess, a hypothesis, for those organizations where this CX stuff is actually working, would you say there's a lot of commonalities? Whereas for those places that it's not working, it's not necessarily the same thing. Could you actually map that quote onto, you see what I mean? Are there real 5 or 6 levers within CX that seem to make it work, whether you're in country A, industry B, or whatever? And I'll tell you why this question came up for me is now and then I'm sure you all see I call them the complaint posts. I'm a such and such flyer with 10, 20 million miles, and this airline really screwed my trip up, and complain. And then another one, complain. Like that, they have the answer for the CX for that entire airline. I'm a bit like, but complaints are one window into the overall experience. And I'm sorry, but not all complaints to me have equal weight, because I mean, I'm not going to complain to McDonald's if they don't serve filet mignon, for example. So anyway, this quote, and I don't mean to take it so far, really made me step back and think and say, I wonder what CX people find in their work. Are there really, if you're working with multiple clients, let's say, do you find that similar kinds of things are happening within their organizations that you could say this relatively uniformly is delivering success? Maybe I'll just stop there with that part of the question. Or is it really different for each one, kind of like Zafar brought up in the Tolstoy quote? I don't mean to take off on a tangent, Megan, I'm sorry.
No, it's not, because it goes to what sticks. Anybody have thoughts on Daniel's question?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a right or a wrong. I'm just curious what
Well, I think you could say that about medicine. You could say that about CX. You could I think that's the beauty of the quote is if you have something to communicate, that is a useful sort of self-instructive quote to be able to make your point. So my answer to you is yes and no,
Okay.
but rather than use that quote to bucket good and not successful and unsuccessful CX, I think that maybe from my perspective, a more useful way of thinking is how could we use that quote to convey something about CX best practices? So in other words, we're saying unsuccessful programs have a myriad of problems, and they may be individual to that institution, the team, whatever their circumstances. But here's what we see in successful programs. Maybe it's compliance with the 6 or 8, whatever they are now, best practices, So I think maybe not being quite so literal with the quote, but looking at it and saying to yourself, gee, that quote said everything about family and culture. How could, in my case, I use it to creatively, to someone else's point, to make my point? So I think that's how I might think about it. I used to teach histology, which is microanatomy, oral histology. So it's in one part of the body. And so I used to use a lot of analogies. The macrophage is a certain kind of big, wobbly, kind of clunky sounding and looking white blood cell that cleans up inflammation. And it's probably that. anyway, there's a lot there. And I used to introduce it as like a garbage truck. It's clanky, it's big, it's not very, it's not very pretty. It's a little smelly. It, might leave behind stuff, right? And there's a lot to that. And what made me realize is we are not using too many analogies when we're talking to people about CX. And that's my bad. I'm trying to think of how, if I'd done that in a different life in this role, how could I do that better? Because I think that's what differentiated my teaching from other people who were reading from a book and using slides. I made it more fun because I was teaching freshman dental students, and they were a breed of their own cat. Not getting much sleep and drinking too much, probably. So I'm taking this as sort of an alert for me to think about getting more creative with how, and not bearing the lead, but how I can be more creative and make things stick. And how I can kind of encourage my own staff to do that.
And Gloria, I want to point, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I want to point something out about that analogy, because this is something that we sort of stumble upon, but we don't always think about, which is finding the right analogy starts with isolating what is it about the thing you're describing that you're trying to pull out. You could have like 75 different characteristics of a CX program or of this white blood cell. And it's like, okay, which are the major ones that I'm trying to draw out? And what is the analogy that best matches that? And that's the process that I'll tell you I go through when I'm trying to find the opening story for a speech. I know what the main point is that I want to make in the speech, but I'll go through 17 different historical stories and business stories and, medical alert. This is where it helps to be a wicked nerd, before I find the one that is really the right mapping. And so I think that's something to think about in customer experience. When I came up with the comparison that customer experience is the eat healthy and exercise of business.
Yeah.
That came from a place of going, everybody says yes, everybody thinks it's important, but for whatever reason, we don't actually do it. What other domains of life are like that? And that was the one that went there. But there's a lot of other analogies you could use. So that's one of the things I think we have to think about is, well, what are we trying to point out as the essence of what is I'm not being articulate. What is it about the nature of the thing that we want people to remember?
Yeah.
Yeah, what do we want to stick, maybe? Because I feel like I'm like, oh, I can articulate a point well, but I level setting on what and maybe I'm in my own world here, but like level setting on what the point is specifically is like a good place to start, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, right. Well, we're offering these two kinds of courses to advance the use of journey mapping and at the AMA and across about 40 or 50 stakeholders. And Jeff and Sarah on my team, we were trying to think of, there's one track you can just learn, and then there's one that you can learn and do. And that's what we decided, right? But then we decided how do we make this fun? So one was the curiosity. What were they? Something curiosity geeks or something. And the other one was the activators. And then we thought, well, then we have to explain it. Why don't we just do learn? And here's the other one, learn and do, like learn and solve a problem. Like, I think sometimes we're trying to make things exciting because we think CX is the only people that are really excited about it is us, let's be frank. But sometimes you just bury, like, why go to that trouble, why put people through that mental exercise? So it's about deciding when you want to be just frank and get over it, move on, And when you want to be creative and have something really resonate, in this case, it's pick a track, people. And we'll get, so I think that's the constant balance that, you read this book and that's what, there's so much communication in CX. There's so many ideas. Maybe they're not all sticky. Maybe they just need to be, get it on, get it over with. But maybe there is something that we want these people to walk away with. And we have to figure that out. We have to figure that one out.
Yeah,
But-
I think that's a really key point, Gloria, which is which ideas are we going to put in the effort to make sticky? Because we
Yeah.
have so many things and so many points and perspectives in customer experience that are different. Which ones are the ones that we want to make people repeat and run with?
Right. And then what's the next step? Like hierarchically, what are we trying to achieve? Are we embedding CX as a measurable attribute of our culture? Then our sticky messages should build to that. But the rest of it is business communication, which I think we learned a lot about that too. But anyway.
One
Yeah.
of the things this makes me think of is there are messages that we want to stick, but what equally concerns me are messages that we don't necessarily want to stick, but still end up sticky. So when I was teaching,
Yeah.
it was always the grades that stuck, but never check the syllabus. When, here in CX, it seems to be much more, people are very concerned about OSAT, but they don't care about the emotions. Or, some of the other peripheral things that explain the OSAT. And, you end up in the managerial mentality that they discussed. And so, I don't know, what are some things that you've all done to make sure that the right messages stick and the wrong ones don't too? Like that flip side of the coin.
I think, Hannah, that's where unexpectedness can be really powerful. So surprising people. So I was just talking to somebody the other day about emotion in B2B. And I got this from somebody at FedEx who said anybody who thinks B2B isn't emotional has never had a vendor they hired's actions threaten their career. What is more emotional than something that could threaten your entire career? And that as a way to sort of reframe what emotion is about in B2B. I think it's when you go, oh, I never thought of it that way. I think unexpectedness can be really powerful there.
I think if you talk about unexpectedness, then I mean, I can refer to the very first example, how the book starts, saying that he went for a drink and then he's minus one kidney. So quite unexpected in the story. And if I can relate it back to CX, then I mean, just thinking and reading that story, I think I would refrain going to a bar for a month and not accepting drink from a stranger. So I think if I draw a kind of corollary with CX, then I would see that what is it that I should surely not do to a customer, and that's going to be like maybe a 0 on a scale of 0 to 10, or that's going to be like the most negative comment on internet. So I look at it that way, saying that story is all about don't accept a drink from a stranger. So don't do X, Y, Z to your customer for sure. That's how I thought about it. And it's a very scary thing.
Yeah. Well, one of Jean Bliss's books was, Would You Do That to Your Dog?
Yep.
And that was sort of the principle. The proverb was, when you think about what you're doing to a customer, think about, was it your dog or your mom? I think it was, she had one book that was about a dog, and then she had another book that was, would you do that to your mom? Sorry. Yeah. And that's I mean, it depends on your relationship with your mom, I suppose, but, I had a client once who started a speech to his executive board. I was in the room with him saying, if we were really a customer-centric company, would we? And then he listed 6 things. And they were 6 things that none of the executives knew were happening. And they were all relatively minor things, but they were so blatantly not. One of them was like, we only send an envelope with every other bill to save money on costs. And that really set up that unexpected contrast too.
One of the things I
What?
was thinking about is, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
One thing I was thinking about is, kind of to Hannah's point about ideas sticking that we don't want to stick. I think we all feel it at times where everything feels like a fire drill, and it's cutting through that, and what's, emotion, is a key part of sticky ideas, and those are a big force in those fire drills. But making sure to counteract that emotion too with something concrete, like, okay, let's stick what is happening and what is the impact, to really kind of cut down noise of less fire drills, focus on what matters by making what matters stick quickly.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that. So we had, Keys to the Castle authentication platform. We're working on a re-engineering of password recovery emails, getting to people faster and in a way that it does not get caught in their spam. And we had a fire drill where we went from an improvement to people were waiting to maybe 3, maybe 4 hours to get their password reset link. And we're in the business of saving lives. So a physician might not be in a surgeon might not be in a theater, but they may be in a break room needing information about benchmarks and those kinds of things. I mean, it's really critical. And so we just had to have the conversation across all the people at the AMA involved, like, well, a half day isn't that bad. And we're like, a half day. And so I started to use the story of, imagine you're a surgeon or a resident, and you're in the break room and you're going into co-lead one of your very first surgeries, and you check out JAMA to look at a review article on whatever, and blood gas levels during surgery, whatever it is. And we've just missed the boat with our value. They've gone on to NEJM, they've gone into the British Medical Journal, they just bypassed us, even though we're the best source. We lost that moment, that emotional tie. And so what we were trying to do is take the operational emotion and shift it over to the customer emotion to try to make people understand through that user story that this was more than an operational boondoggle that, hey, we got the server up in a half day. That's great. No. That's not, well, yes, but how can we avoid this? Because we certainly don't want that to be the standard. So tapping into those emotions and then moving them to through a customer lens. And so I love the storytelling in this. It reminded us. In fact, I was reading this book when I was talking to the Salesforce people and giving them that story to try to help them understand this is not just your normal business outage. There are patients and physicians' practices at risk. And that started making a big difference.
Yeah. And I think that's a combination of stories that create context, but that also create concreteness. Because the idea of a person looking up information can happen in very different contexts. Now, there are probably other stories where a half a day would be perfectly fine, but it depends on, and it's about which scenario are we going to design for. But I think people don't think about those things. So stories like that are unexpected and very tangible. And I think that helps make people think about what timely means in a given situation.
Doesn't it also make us think, when we think of the vendors that we work with, maybe they really don't know what our brand is and who we are and what we do. So that's a whole nother potential outcome out of that, but that's a different story. And that's a story. And then becomes a strategy, a communication.
They don't know, or they don't think about it.
They probably don't know. I bet you they signed a contract and for a operational function. And as long as they're fulfilling their SLA, maybe they feel good about that. So it really made me think about Vendor X, and we haven't tipped our toe in there, but I'm thinking a lot about that.
I like Hannah's point on ideas that don't stick, and I like the story about the 4-hour response time. And Hannah, I don't know if this also fits or Megan, but I listened to a webinar during the pandemic from the head of CX for Hyundai here in Europe. And if you've ever worked with a Korean or Japanese company, you know it's extremely hierarchical. It's just the nature of the beast. So Hyundai at that time had a very strong playbook. All dealerships, whether they're in Italy, Romania, Germany, wherever, must follow exactly the same playbook. So that was what I call a cultural belief. That's the term I use. That was a cultural belief at Hyundai. What this CX gentleman had done is he managed to convince the leadership in Seoul to relax the standards, because you don't run a dealership in France the same way you do in Belgium. That's very culturally different. And he talked about his success in doing that. So Hannah, when I heard you talk about how do we undo these ideas that stick, what came to my mind are these kind of cultural beliefs that are in a way endemic and impacting potentially everyone. And then do we approach those ideas? Now, I don't know how this gentleman actually did it, and if he used any of the tips in the book, maybe he did, but he was successful. And I remember just telling this story a couple of weeks ago to a Korean audience at Hyatt. They have a contact center there in Seoul. And they said, this is an unbelievable story for us, because what you describe about our culture is 100% true. And we didn't actually know there were ways to crack the ice here. They were, and they're Korean. They're like, we really didn't even know that was possible to do, for example. So it's interesting how those stories can migrate across geographies and industries. Thank you, Hannah, for that point. Yeah.
Thanks for that story. Really interesting.
Well, and that's interesting that sometimes the ideas we're trying to make stick is the fact that ideas that people believe to be universally and unequivocally true are not actually universally and unequivocally true. I never thought about it that way.
Or maybe they change. Maybe they were true. You know, maybe they were true. But how you impose, how, you know, change culture doesn't happen at once, right? And there's a lot of threads you have to go back, and things you don't even know, beliefs, values, practices, operations, systems, whatever it is, you have to go back and clean up, even though you have charted what you think is a really comprehensive change management process, right? There's always, I call them kind of hanging threads, missing, and some of them aren't so small.
Yeah, Gloria, that makes me think of one of the things I will sometimes talk about. I think I said this at the last CXPA event, was when I started in customer experience, there was no iPhone. And I don't say that to reinforce how old I am. I say that to remind people how different the world is now than it was even not that long ago, in ways that, curse of knowledge, so far we've forgotten what it was like to have a life without smartphones. And I think that's another way that some of those cultural beliefs or some of those other things can be broken, is by kind of reminding people, you know, hey, this hasn't always been this way.
I think some of the ideas, some of the slogans or some of the ideas is hard to be broken, because some of the harmful ideas is hard to be broken, because human nature kind of gravitates toward negativity and some harmful activities. I think it's part of our nature that some bad things is really likely to stick, maybe that's why it's hard to be, forgotten or outdone.
Oh yeah, there's definitely a bias towards remembering negative things. It was a TED Talk and also a book by Steven Pinker. And it was basically about I know everybody I think it was out in 2016. I know everybody feels like the world is going to hell in a handbasket, but in reality, we've never been safer and healthier. And looking at the data, that's actually a great example of kind of flipping some things on their heads. I don't know that it allays that many people's fears, but it was a really powerful reframing of, oh, okay, maybe the world as I experience it or imagine it is not actually what is.
Well, and that's where I think, when you get to in CX, we need this book. I mean, mine is dog-eared and written on and do this, don't do that. It's so, and I think the reason we over communicate sometimes, maybe to the point that it is ineffective, bearing the lead, not tying it to emotion, yada da da, is that we're so worried about leaving a negative impression because we know we work so hard to build change and to get people on board that it's like we just don't want to leave it to chance that maybe we will do an effective job. But I think in doing that, it's sort of setting us up because there is only so, but we do still have to think about very forwardly what we want to accomplish. I don't know with each individual, but certainly with stakeholder groups, it really needs to be strategic. And almost to the point where it's like we have a strategy around each of our 12 major stakeholder groups, but it's almost like I want to go back to my team and say, what is the sticky message we want them to walk away with this year or this quarter or whatever? Like we know what we're doing, and we know where it's going, but from a messaging standpoint, what would success look like? And that's hard work.
Well, that first simplicity principle to me is the keystone of this entire book. And it is the most difficult thing. I mean, we used to get 30 exceptionally smart people in a room at Forrester, and it would still take us 3 days to figure out what the heck we were all trying to say in one sentence or less. And I think that's the piece that we don't do the hard work on, Gloria. We're afraid to leave something out. But in reality, by not leaving things out, we're getting nothing across.
Right.
So it's like, what's the one thing I want this person to remember or come away with? Period.
Right.
And then how do I articulate it in an unexpected way? How do I make it concrete? How do I back it up with data?
I wanted to share a story where the concrete chapter in particularly helped me with my home life. So a few months back, my wife is saying, because we have a 5-year-old, our place is always a mess. She's like, I really want to keep this place tidier. I just feel anxious. And I'm like, yeah, definitely, I will help more. And then weeks went by, and I just realized I wasn't really doing a better job. And she called me out on it, and I was like, oh yeah, I'll do better. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, well, I'm making the same promises over and over again. What can I do to actually achieve this? So the concrete chapter came up, and I was like, oh, what are the key areas I can focus on to keep tidy? And it was great. I have a clear plan now. Like, all right, these are my areas. I own it. I'll keep it tidy. So it's less like overwhelming or feel like you're boiling in the ocean of like, all right, yeah, we got to keep the whole house tidy. And it's like, well, that's impossible. So you just kind of freeze and don't do it.
Jeff, that reminded me of a story from way back in the old CX days. Do you guys know Ingrid Lindberg? Do any of you know Ingrid Lindberg? She's awesome. She was the first chief customer officer at Cigna. And she's a Spitfire. And she was trying to get the idea that customers are overwhelmed, members are overwhelmed. We're communicating too much. And so she asked a couple people to gather up every email, every piece of paper mail, everything that a particular person got within, say, 6 months. And she wallpapered an entire conference room with them. She taped them up to the wall and had people come in who were responsible for generating those messages and said, please find your message.
Wow.
And that was a way to make concrete this vague concept of we're overwhelming people, we're bombarding people.
Oh, wow.
So thinking about what are some, and especially as we get more digital, right? What are some metaphors or ways that we can translate into, imagine there was another one I heard, a company had a 45% call transfer rate in their contact center. So 45% of their calls had to be transferred to another department. And they said, if we were a manufacturer and we shipped our product to the wrong place 45% of the time, would that be okay? And it's like, well, duh, obviously not.
Yeah.
But we never thought about it that way. So those are you just reminded me of two examples of concreteness that when you make it specific like that, it helps you act, but it also sort of brings the human impact
All right.
to scale.
I might have read that and stolen that. I've always thought we did something similar in the contact center where no one could understand why the agents were just not retaining information. And so for 3 months, I had every one of those emails stacked up, and it was literally 3 piles of email on a credenza. They were ridiculous. And that was the beginning of our knowledge portal and a lot of other things that we do to reinforce information now. And but maybe I read an article about Ingrid and I always thought it was my own. Isn't that funny?
That might be an outside in. We might have put that one in outside in. I don't remember.
Well, it's before I read Outside In. That's funny. I probably did read it and I thought I was a genius. I probably stole it and didn't even know it.
The best of Proverbs are Proverbs because the best ideas are universal.
Yeah, that's true. That is the best compliment.
So we've got technically 9 minutes left, but I want to give people a couple minutes, and selfishly, I have another call at 1, so I want to give myself a little break. But before we break, I wanted to just open the floor for anybody who has something that you are actively trying to communicate or get to stick as a brainstorming exercise. Is there something that you're trying to get across that we might collectively be able to help you with?
Well, I know we have something, but I want to make sure that I don't usurp others. So Megan, I can talk to you about this anytime, but we have something unless somebody else has something.
Okay.
Go for it. You go.
Do you know IELTS exam? It's pretty common in Asia, and it's a standardized test where students should take in order to get accepted into European or Western universities. So it's very popular in where I live. And every class we have to translate academic, very difficult passages. And sometimes, mostly, students are knowledgeable enough to translate it into their language, but even though they know the translation, they don't know the meaning. They don't know the whole gist of the paragraph. They can't see the big picture of the paragraphs. So, and then I always tell them, if you don't understand something, please ask. And very funny thing, even though they have vague ideas, they don't consider themselves as someone don't understand the text. So they never ask. So they never bother asking because they all think they understand the text, even though they have very vague, unclear ideas about the text. So I have to get across the message that if you have unclear ideas, please ask what's the real meaning. And I have been trying to get this message across for like months and months without any veil, without any effect. I mean, that's the real problem among students. They want to categorize themselves as someone who understand the text. I mean,
So they think they understand, but they don't really.
yeah, because I ask questions. Okay, if you understand the question, please answer this question. What does the author mean by stating this information or by giving this statistics? They have no answer, but they don't ask. I mean, it's very difficult to make them really engaged in the text. I don't know.
You know, this is not unlike teaching in a contact center. So we have universal agents, which means everyone can do pretty much anything as long as they've gone up the rank to do that. But in terms of who we're serving and what the needs are and what channel. Okay. So that takes synthesis level of knowledge to be able to do that. And that's what you're asking for in your students. Like not just the translation, but then the true understanding of the meaning. So you're looking for that higher order
Yes.
level of understanding. And Hannah, I don't know, but you may be better able to explain that. I think that's an area that you work in, but what we find is practice sessions, role playing, repeating the story. Well, I don't know what is but when you engage the person like that, they're doing the first step of the learning, right? They're doing the translation,
Yes.
but they're not taking the next step to really apply that. So when you want them to be able to understand it, so I think I would ask you, like, is there something that you can do, an intervening component that would give them the opportunity to take those small steps and maybe do it in ways they can initially be successful and then build their confidence and get them to that higher order of learning? Anyone else?
Yeah, I would like
It's only
to
a second,
add
but
something.
I think we have a case here where people don't know what they don't know.
Right.
And that's a very difficult, you're not going to solve that with hoping they figure out what
Get
they
there,
don't know.
right.
I think it's exactly what Gloria just said. You're going to have to come up with intermediate steps, which is, why don't we do this? I'm not suggesting any formal exercise here, but let's frame this question and you guys talk about, what do you think character Vanya was really thinking when he was talking to Annette or whatever? And let them talk about it and see, because until they actually, as Gloria said, try this out for themselves, just asking people to make something that's vague, concrete, they really just don't know what they don't know. And I think it might be even a little bit unfair. Can I give another contact center example and then I'll be quiet? Like for me, Gloria, this is a case where if I'm hiring a new person in a contact center, I don't play a call for them and say, do you think that's a good call or not a good call? Because I think that's mean, because they don't know the expectation yet. They don't know what my
Right.
judgment is. They don't, it's just cruel. But after X numbers of coaching sessions and understanding what's expected, now I should be able to play a call and say, what do you think? Because they'll have a lens through which to filter what they're seeing. So that's how I see it so far, but I'll be quiet. There are probably others too, but that's, yeah.
Thank you.
I think in the book, The Catalyst, they talked a little bit about, I hope I'm remembering the right book. The give the DARE program in the US, and like basically kids weren't stopping like drug and alcohol use. It was like in fact increasing, and they tried all these campaigns, and in the end they said like, okay, like we as adults basically don't know what to do, so they interviewed kids and essentially gave them control over the campaign. And then all of a sudden, like they were all over the marketing, they were all over the messaging, and I guess the rates ended up going down. So like maybe giving them an opportunity to say what they think would help, or
Very
a way
good point.
they want to interact. And then the other thing, I'm not sure how to do this more tangibly, but like, we don't really do failure well in a lot of like professional settings, and something something to consider is like creating a culture of like it's okay to fail. So yeah, I don't know how exactly, or nothing specifics coming to mind, but yeah, just that sentiment.
Yeah. I was going to suggest asking them to paraphrase it, asking one person in the class to say, okay, can you tell everybody what you think this means? And other people in the audience are probably going to have had other interpretations that nobody's wrong. They're just other interpretations. I do this sometimes with executives. I'll get them to all write down, what word comes to mind when you think of this. And there's a group of 30 executives and there's 36 words, and they're all different because they didn't realize that they were thinking about it in different ways. So that could be one, another way to do it. But
in fact, I would like to add, as you rightly said, just yesterday I had a hour-long chat with Lazada Research on, I was speaking on empathy. And while I was speaking on empathy, I did a lot of research in terms of YouTube videos. And what I understood of a common theme in empathy, all videos related to CX and even not related to CX, is they're talking about a 5-step framework, which is more like you need to listen to them first, then kind of, ask the students to maybe elaborate what do they want to say. And as you rightly touched upon, the third point talked about paraphrasing it. Is this XYZ what you wanted to say? And then kind of verbalize it so that they feel that they are not being judged, but we are just trying to kind of validate what they want to say. So I really like that 5-point approach, right from listen, paraphrase to validate, what you touched upon. Maybe the students might have a more confidence that, somebody cares or somebody trusts me, and then I can put it in my own words what I've understood. And if that is not what the teacher wants, then we know where the gap lies.
Giving instant feedbacks.
Yeah, that would be at the end, but trying to more put them saying, would you like to talk what is in your mind, so that you exactly understand if there's a gap between what you wanted to communicate and what was expected.
And also, I think bringing that back to what Megan said, give everybody a chance to know what you want to say in the end. You know what you want to get across, but give everyone a chance to fail or succeed by providing their feedback so that you engage them in that part of the learning. But I think it's really important to end with, it's not really up for grabs, right? In this case, it really does have a meaning to make sure you end with, this is really what it meant. And thank you all for contributing to that, and just continue and hope to see that you get answers that are closer to your true north eventually, but giving people the opportunity and kind of saying, hey, you got to think about this. Like, this is not just the last step in this preparation for this test. They're going to ask you what this means. So I'm only helping you get there. And this is the most important step, because they're not going to just look at the translation.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to leave it on that note. Thank you guys for joining. I'll be sending out the recording and everything as we usually do. And just a reminder, our next book is a continuation of this topic, but much more concrete. It's called Making Numbers Count. And it's specifically about how to get numbers to mean something to people in a way that makes them act. So May 9th, I hope I will see you there, and thank you.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank
well
you.
Done.
Thanks so much, Megan.
Everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Nice meeting all of you.
Yeah, great